What is going on, lovely people? This is Medicosis Perfectionis, where medicine makes perfect sense. Today's video is the most important video in my endocrinology playlist. If you remember my hematology playlist, I had a similar video about distinctions in oncology. The difference between lymphomas and leukemias is like the difference between a lemon and lemonade. This is kind of a similar video. Distinctions in endocrinology. The insulin land versus the glucagon land. Insulin stan versus glucagon stan. This is the land of abundance, but glucagon is a land of scarcity. This is the feeding world. This is the fasting world. When you eat too much, especially carbohydrate, insulin gets excited. And insulin is like your wise grandmother will save some of these goodies for a rainy day. Conversely, glucagon, scarcity. You're fasting, you're not eating anything. Glucagon will start breaking down some of the goodies that insulin stored. Break this down and let's burn it to get energy, lest this doofus should starve to death. Even though the contrast between insulin and glucagon could not have been more stark, they actually came from the same organ, the pancreas. Not only this, both of them came from the endocrine pancreas. Insulin comes from the beta cells, glucagon comes from the alpha cells. When you eat carbohydrate, protein, and fat. Carbohydrates will be broken down into polysaccharides, monosaccharides, because your gut can only absorb small stuff. Alright, how about protein? Break it down into polypeptide and then amino acid. Your gut will absorb the amino acid. The fat, triglycerides, and then glycerol, usually monoglycerides or diglycerides, and free fatty acids. Let's absorb these. And of course, we're gonna lump them with fat-soluble vitamins. In this endocrinology playlist, we talked about the intracellular receptors, the story of steroid, thyroid, vitamin D. We also talked about the G protein, the story of glucagon and epinephrine and the other catecholamines. We just talked about GABA in the last video, as well as the serine-threonine receptor protein. It's time to talk about insulin. A tale of two worlds, the insulin world versus the glucagon world. This is by far the most important fact in endocrinology, is that we have two worlds, insulin world and glucagon world. Insulin world is dominated by insulin alone. Insulin doesn't need any partners. But the glucagon world contains glucagon, cortisol, epinephrine, thyroxine, basically anything that's not insulin. So, breathe and digest. Insulin is on one hand, all the other hormones are on the other hand. If insulin does X, glucagon is gonna do Y, the exact opposite. Not just glucagon, cortisol, epinephrine, thyroxine. But hey, medicosis, Y is not the opposite of X. Okay, math sophisticated, let's call it 1 minus X. Insulin wants to build up stuff. Glucagon, epinephrine, cortisol, and the others break down stuff. Insulin is anabolic. The rest are catabolic. Insulin is a builder. The other team are destroyers. So without even continuing, if I tell you that insulin will build up more glycogen, what do you think epinephrine does? Epinephrine will break down glycogen. Duh! If insulin builds up triglycerides, big fat, what do you think glucagon does? Breaks down triglycerides, the big fat, into free fatty acid, small fat. If insulin converts the amino acid into big proteins, what do you think glucagon does? Destroys the big proteins into small amino acids. See, medicine makes so much sense once you understand what the flip you're talking about. Insulin world is the feeding state, but glucagon stan is the fasting stan. A land of abundance, a land of scarcity. And that's why when you eat lots of sugar, you get more obese. How come? Because you ate a lot. Insulin will save this stuff for you because it's anabolic and you will build up storage units called fat.
But hey, medicosis, I'm getting more obese. How can I lose weight?
Well, stop eating. Well, that was insightful. Insulin stan versus glucagon stan, the builder versus the destroyer, the feeding versus the fasting. When you're eating too much, it's time to convert those amino acids into protein. Store the stuff for a rainy day, like a wise grandma. Get that glucose into glycogen and store it. Get those small free fatty acids into large triglycerides. When you convert amino acid to proteins, we call this protein synthesis or proteogenesis. When we convert glucose into glycogen, we call this glycogen synthesis or glycogenesis. When we convert free fatty acids into triglycerides, we call this lipid synthesis, fat synthesis, or lipogenesis. In other words, insulin will stimulate proteogenesis, glycogenesis, and lipogenesis. Glucagon, epinephrine, cortisol, thyroxine, the exact opposite, baby. Protein, destroy that protein into amino acid. Why do you want to? Because I can take those amino acids and convert them to glucose. This is gluconeogenesis. How about glycogen? Break that glycogen down. I'm starving to death. Break it down to glucose so that I can burn it and get some energy, lest I should starve to death. How about those triglycerides? Break them down into free fatty acids, but anytime you break down fat, you get ketone bodies. Ketone bodies are acids such as acetone, acetoacetic acid, beta-hydroxybutyric acid. These are keto acids. They can cause metabolic acidosis. When you're building up fat, you do not release ketones, but when you're breaking down fat, you're causing ketones. That's why when you see ketone bodies, this is glucagon world, this is not insulin world. And that's why patients with type 1 diabetes who lack insulin will get what? No insulin land, more glucagon land, more ketone bodies. They get a disease known as diabetic ketoacidosis. See, medicine makes so much sense once you understand what the frick you're talking about. What is the most important fact in endocrinology? That insulin alone is in one land, all the other hormones are in the other land. Insulin is anabolic, protein anabolic, glycogen anabolic, triglyceride anabolic. I make protein, I make glycogen, I make triglycerides. But glucagon, cortisol, epinephrine, thyroxine, protein catabolic because I break down protein into amino acid, glycogen catabolic because I break down glycogen into glucose, triglyceride catabolic because I break down triglycerides into free fatty acids, releasing ketone bodies in the process. How about growth hormone? Growth hormone is kind of in between. It's taking some pieces from this land and some parts from this land. Growth hormone is weird. More on this in another video. Hey insulin, what did you do? I built up muscle. I'm protein anabolic. Hey glucagon, epinephrine, cortisol, thyroxine, what did you guys do? We destroy protein. Hey insulin, what did you do to the glycogen and triglyceride? Well, I built up glucose into glycogen. I built free fatty acid into triglycerides. That's why if you look at my blood has less glucose and less free fatty acid. I am insulin and I decrease glucose and free fatty acid in your blood. However, glucagon, epinephrine, cortisol, thyroxine, they break down glycogen into glucose and break down triglyceride into free fatty acids. So if you look in my blood, you'll see more glucose and more fatty acids in the blood. Growth hormone is very weird because it's taking the first sentence from the insulin land, but it's taking the second sentence from the glucagon land. If you understood this page, you will cruise through endocrinology like a sharp knife through warm butter. Charles Dickens said, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. This was a tale of two cities." Medicosis wrote A Tale of Two Hormones, insulin versus glucagon. It was the land of anabolism. It was the land of catabolism. It was the age of proteogenesis. It was the age of proteolysis. It was the epoch of lipogenesis. It was the epoch of lipolysis. It was the season of glycogenesis. It was the season of glycogenolysis. It was the spring of anti-ketosis. It was the winter of ketone bodies. Why winter? Because it leads to ketoacidosis, which is a metabolic acidosis, specifically HAGMA, high anion gap metabolic acidosis. Now, why doesn't your woke professor teach like this?
Medicine is so hard and nothing makes sense.
Oh, shut up. Medicine is beautiful if you understand what the French toast you're talking about. So let's do this game. Glycogen. If you convert glycogen to glucose, is this breaking down or building up? This is breaking down. Do you think this is glucagon land or insulin land? It has to be glucagon land because breaking down glycogen to glucose is called glycogenolysis, and this is fasting state, which is glucagon land, and glucagon is secreted from the alpha cells of the pancreas. How about doing the opposite, converting glucose into glycogen? This is called glycogen synthesis, and this is insulin's 10. Insulin is feeding and insulin is secreted by the beta cells of the pancreas. Remember when we said before, the ligand alone is not active, the receptor alone is not active, but the ligand receptor complex is active. That's why pathology can hit me here. This is called type 1 diabetes, where I have no insulin, or pathology can hit me here. I have insulin, but the receptor is not working, and this is type 2 diabetes. What are ketone bodies? In nature, they are acids, because listen to the name. Acetone, acetoacetic acid, beta-hydroxybutyric acid. You can write it as beta-hydroxybutyrate or beta-hydroxybutyric acid. Acid, acid, this is acidosis. That's why when you have too much ketone bodies in your blood, you get what? Acidosis. Medicosis pearls for the pros. Insulin is the major anti-ketogenic hormone. How about glucagon, thyroxine? No, shut up. All of these are pro-ketosis. Insulin alone is anti-ketosis. That's why if you have normal insulin, you should never have ketosis. But what if I do not have insulin? In other words, I have type 1 diabetes. They get ketosis all the time, and we call this diabetic ketoacidosis. Why acidosis? Because ketone bodies are acids. The ligand alone is not active, the receptor alone is not active. The ligand receptor complex is active. Diseases can hit me here, type 1, or hit me here, type 2. And this is true for diabetes mellitus or diabetes insipidus. Remember, central diabetes insipidus, I have no ADH. But in nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, ADH exists, but the kidney receptor is not listening. Type 1 versus type 2 diabetes. Type 1, what's the problem? The problem is that I have no insulin. Therefore, no insulin, no anti-ketogenic properties. You get what? You get ketone bodies, you get ketosis, and the disease is known as diabetic ketoacidosis because I have too many ketones. But how about type 2 diabetes? Well, type 2, the receptor is not working, right? However, insulin is fine. Insulin is present, at least early in the disease. If you have insulin, you will have anti-ketogenic properties of insulin, therefore no ketosis. If you have a disease, it will be called hyperosmolar, hyperglycemic, non-ketotic syndrome. Because if insulin is there is no ketosis. It makes perfect sense. As you know, the pancreas has two functions, exocrine and endocrine. Exocrine is secreting enzymes through ducts to a nearby structure such as the duodenum. And these enzymes are here among others. How about endocrine? Ductless. The pancreas will just dump these hormones into the bloodstream and the blood will take it to distant places all over your body. The beta cells are in the center. Why? Because they have central function. They secrete the most important hormone, insulin, which is the only player in the insulin land. So you have to put them in the center because they are the crowning jewel. How about alpha, which secrete glucagon? I'll put it on the periphery. No one cares. We have epinephrine, we have cortisol, we have thyroxine. Glucagon is not that important. It's one of the team. Delta, interspersed between alpha and beta cells, secretes somatostatin, a universal inhibitor. It inhibits everything. It inhibits insulin secretion. It inhibits glucagon secretion. It even inhibits its own secretion. Isn't that crazy? There is a medication in pharmacology that is a somatostatin analog called octreotide. The good news is, if you have a tumor secreting anything in crazy amounts, give octreotide because it's going to inhibit everything. Fasting state, this is glucagon land. Break down stuff to get me energy. Glucagon is water soluble. It acts by a GS-coupled receptor. It's the G protein story. Do you remember the story? Yes, GS-coupled activate adenylate cyclase converts ATP to cyclic AMP, activate protein kinase A, which will increase all of this stuff. When it comes to glucagon, you will have metabolic functions, such as proteolysis, gluconeogenesis, glycogenolysis, lipolysis. The G protein is how glucagon works. It's also how epinephrine works. It's all about kinase and phosphorylation, baby. Glucagon phosphorylates rate-limiting enzymes. So if glucagon phosphorylates rate-limiting enzyme, then insulin will dephosphorylate rate-limiting enzyme. It makes sense. Do you remember the story of ATP? Yeah, ATP into cyclic AMP and then degradation products such as 5' AMP. From ATP to cyclic AMP, adenylate cyclase. From cyclic AMP to the pieces of trash, phosphodiesterase. I've just told you 3 seconds ago that glucagon increases cyclic AMP. Alright, how? By stimulating GS and stimulating allyl cyclase. If glucagon increases cyclic AMP, what do you think insulin does? Insulin decreases cyclic AMP by boosting its destroyer. It boosts phosphodiesterase, which takes cyclic AMP to the cleaners. If glucagon phosphorylates, insulin is going to dephosphorylate, and vice versa. If glucagon stimulates a kinase, insulin will stimulate a phosphatase. If glucagon adds a phosphate, insulin removes a phosphate, because a kinase is an enzyme that adds phosphate, a phosphatase is an enzyme that removes a phosphate. When glucagon increases cyclic AMP, insulin will decrease cyclic AMP. So let's put protein kinase A in the middle, and then let's play this game. If I'm eating, this is abundance land, anabolism, this is insulin. Insulin will decrease protein kinase A by taking cyclic AMP to the cleaners. How about if I'm fasting and running from a tiger? Fasting is glucagon. Running from a tiger is the sympathetic nervous system, such as beta. Both of them will increase cyclic AMP and increase protein kinase A. Insulin is anti-glucagon. Anabolism is anti-catabolism. Eating is anti-exercising. And now you can make a philosophical argument that insulin is anti-sympathetic and pro-parasympathetic, because parasympathetic was rest and digest. It makes sense. Let's talk about insulin stan. Happens when you're eating. Okay, give me glucose. Oh, that's too much glucose in the blood. Let me convert to glycogen. Oh, too many amino acids in the blood. Let me convert them into proteins. Too much glycerin-free fatty acid. Let me convert them to triglyceride. This is insulin land. Pause and review. Pause and review. Let's put it all together. You eat, you have too much glucose in the blood. This glucose will stimulate the pancreas. Hey pancreas, be careful. There is too much glucose in the blood. Basically, this glucose will enter into the pancreas via GLUT2. Tell that beta cell, hey beta cell, by the way, there is too much of us in the blood.
Oh, too much glucose? Let me secrete insulin,
said the beta cell of the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. Now we have insulin. What does insulin do to the glucose? Push it inside the cell. To do what? To burn it if you want it, or to store it in form of glycogen. What's the name of the door in the target cell that lets glucose in? It's called GLUT4. But what was the name of the door in the pancreas that let the glucose in? GLUT2. Which one is dependent on insulin? Of course, GLUT4, because when GLUT2 was stimulated, insulin did not exist yet. All the GLUTs do not depend on insulin, except GLUT4. So first, we'll talk about this story, and then we'll talk about this story. The first story, too much glucose in the blood. After this meal, glucose will enter into the beta cell of the pancreas through GLUT2. Glucose comes in, but this glucose can just go back out. How can we fix it inside the cell? Phosphorylate it, because phosphorylation fixes stuff. All right, glucose 6-phosphate. Now this glucose 6-phosphate cannot leave, cannot go back. All right, glucose 6-phosphate will trigger the process of glycolysis, because go back to biochemistry. You start with glucose, and then glucose 6-phosphate, and then boom, 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 and then you get pyruvate, you get all of your ATPs, etc. This will increase the ATP to ADP ratio inside the cell. Too much ATP will close the potassium channel, preventing potassium efflux. The purpose of this channel, may she rest in peace, was to let potassium out. Okay, now I'll close the channel. Potassium will stay in. Potassium is positive. When something positive stays inside the cell, this is depolarization. Hashtag activation. Activation of what? Of this beautiful calcium channel. Calcium channel will open. Calcium will rush into the beta cell. Calcium contraction of those vesicles. Boom! Rupture those vesicles. Secrete that doozy insulin into the bloodstream. Whenever you secrete insulin from the pancreas, you'll also secrete C-peptide. It's part of the game. How about the second story when insulin gets the glucose into the target cell? We'll talk about this in the next video, but here, let's compare between insulin and glucagon. Insulin is protein anabolic, glucagon is protein catabolic. Insulin is glycogen anabolic, glucagon is glycogen catabolic. Insulin is fat anabolic, glucagon is fat catabolic. Insulin is the only major anti-ketogenic hormone in your blood, but glucagon is pro-ketosis, as you see. Insulin dephosphorylates the rate-limiting enzyme. Glucagon phosphorylates. Phosphorylate how? By a kinase. And you dephosphorylate why? Because I stimulate a phosphatase. I inhibit the kinase. I stimulate a phosphatase. How did glucagon increase this protein kinase A? By increasing the cyclic AMP. However, insulin decreases cyclic AMP because it took it to the cleaners. Just imagine, assume that you are a stupid crazy doctor. You gave too much beta blocker. Oh, too much beta blocker. The patient can die from bradycardia, heart block, hypotension, stroke, you name it. How can I go back? How can I reverse it? Give glucagon, because glucagon can act as an antidote for beta blocker. I don't get it. Remember, beta stimulation increases cyclic AMP. Therefore, beta blockers decrease cyclic AMP. However, when you give glucagon, you will increase cyclic AMP. Oh, they are kind of antagonists. So if you gave too much beta blockers, it's time to reverse it by giving glucagon. In the next video, we'll talk about how insulin acts on the receptor in the target organ. This is called the receptor tyrosine kinase, or RTK. If you want to master the diabetic ketoacidosis and how to manage it, check out my acid-base imbalance course on my website, medicosisperfectionalis.com. To learn more about the different types of insulin and the doses and the calculations, check out my endocrine pharmacology course. To learn more about beta blockers, the antihypertensives, the antiarrhythmics, check out my cardiac pharmacology course. And for a limited time only, you can get a 40% discount towards anything on my website. Just use promo code KIDNEY at checkout. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, hit the bell, and click on the join button. You can support me here or here. Go to my website to download my courses. Be safe, stay happy, study hard. This is Medicosis Perfectionalis, where medicine makes perfect sense.